All right, welcome in everybody to the deep dive. We're going to be tackling a pretty wild one today.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at the Dyatlov Pass Incident. So this is one that has just kind of captivated people's imagination for a long, long time. It happened way back in February of 1959, and it involved a group of 9 experienced hikers, and they were in the Ural Mountains, and they met a very mysterious end, a very strange end. The initial explanation that the Soviet government gave was just something like a compelling natural force.
Mhm.
But that really didn't do much to satisfy people's curiosity. And it's just remained a mystery ever since that's attracted all kinds of theories.
Absolutely. And it's a mystery with so many layers. I mean, on the
Mm.
surface, what we have is a group of, as you mentioned, seasoned outdoor enthusiasts,
Mm.
experienced hikers who end up meeting a very tragic and very baffling end. And it's that sort of contrast, right, between experience and the unknown that really makes this one so compelling.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're going to be looking at some articles from history, all that's interesting, and the Science History Institute. You pulled these together for us. And what I thought was really interesting was that these articles were published across a significant span of time, which really shows that this isn't just some like forgotten event or something. This is a mystery that has persisted. People keep coming back to it, keep investigating it, and people, like you, still have questions. So what we're hoping to do in this episode is to kind of unpack the key facts of the incident and really try to understand what the leading scientific theory is today without getting too bogged down in all the little tiny details.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good approach. It's very easy, especially with an event like this that's attracted so much attention, so much speculation, to get lost in the weeds. So yeah, the goal is to give everybody listening a clear understanding of what happened and what the most credible explanation is according to, our current understanding of the evidence.
Okay, sounds good. So let's set the scene. It's January 1959, and we have this group of 10 hikers setting off into the Ural Mountains. What can we learn about this initial expedition?
Well, first of all, we know this area, the Ural Mountains. These are incredibly rugged and unforgiving in the winter. It's not for the faint of heart. And this group, led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student, they were mostly fellow students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, all but one, actually. They had with them an experienced sports instructor in his late 30s as well. So a mix of, I guess you could say, youthful enthusiasm and seasoned experience.
Right. 10 of them in total initially, and as we know from the background on this case, it wasn't long into the trip, only about 5 days, when one of the hikers, Yuri Udin, was forced to turn back. He had a pretty bad flare-up of sciatica. It's pretty painful, actually. And in a strange twist, that, unfortunate event for him at the time actually ended up saving his life.
Yeah, very much so. A sobering reminder, I think, about the unpredictable nature of these sorts of expeditions, even for the most well-prepared. So, with Yudin backtracking, the remaining 9 pressed on. They were aiming to cover roughly 190 miles over about 16 days, a pretty ambitious undertaking. And they had planned to send a telegram when they reached the village of Vizhai around February 20th. But when that telegram didn't arrive, well, as you can imagine, concern began to grow, and eventually a search party was organized.
And it's what that search party found in those weeks that follow that really started to make this incident so unsettling, so mysterious. They located the first 5 bodies scattered across the snow, and this is where things take a truly bizarre turn. Some of these individuals were in various states of undress. They didn't have all their clothes on, which is strange in itself given the freezing conditions. But they also had injuries that were really difficult to explain. One of the hikers, Krivonashenko, it looked as if he had actually bitten his own hand, like taken chunks of flesh out of his own hand. It's pretty disturbing.
Absolutely. It really paints a picture of people in extreme distress in a situation that clearly went very wrong very quickly. And the initial assessment for these first 5 was death by hypothermia, which in those conditions, wouldn't be entirely surprising. But as you point out, those additional details, those strange injuries, the missing clothing, it all suggests something far beyond a simple case of exposure to the elements. And then, of course, there's the discovery of the remaining 4 bodies months later when the snow began to thaw.
Yeah, and this is where things go from unsettling to just completely perplexing. These last 4, they were found in what seemed to be a snow den of sorts, or maybe a shallow pit near a stream. And their injuries were much more severe than those found on the first 5. We're talking like a fractured skull, crushed chests, really significant trauma, the kind of injuries you might associate with a car crash.
Exactly. Thibaut Brignol had that horrific skull fracture. Zolotaryov and Dubinina had these massive chest injuries, just crushed. And it goes even further. Zolotaryov and Dubinina, they were missing their eyes, and Dubinina was also missing her tongue, parts of her lips, some facial tissue, even a piece of her skull. It's a truly gruesome picture. There's no other way to put it.
It is, and it throws up so many questions. And to make things even more strange, some of the clothing found on these later bodies, it had been swapped. Like they were wearing each other's clothes. It's just weird. And then there's the initial Soviet investigation, which, as we said, just concluded that it was a compelling natural force. It's so vague. It basically tells us nothing, which is probably why so many people were unsatisfied with that explanation.
Right, exactly. And it's that lack of a clear, detailed explanation combined with all these incredibly unusual circumstances that really gave rise to all those alternative theories and speculations. The public, especially in the Soviet Union, I mean, they were understandably suspicious. That lack of transparency from the authorities, it just breeds distrust.
Absolutely. And to make that suspicion even worse, they later found traces of radiation on some of the clothing from the hikers. Now, the Science History Institute article that you pointed us to does mention a potential explanation for that, right? It talks about the Kishdim disaster a few years earlier, which involved a nuclear accident, and some of the hikers had actually participated in the cleanup efforts.
Yeah, that's an important detail. It offers a possible, if somewhat disturbing, link to the radiation findings. However, rather than resolving the mystery, it kind of just added fuel to the fire, especially for those who believed there was some sort of cover-up going on?
Yeah, so you have this collection of strange details, no real explanation, and people naturally start coming up with all sorts of theories. I mean, some of them are pretty wild, like encounters with a Yeti or secret military weapons testing. And of course, there are the ever-popular KGB or CIA conspiracies.
Oh, yeah. Those are never far behind when you have a mystery like this, are they? And then, as if those weren't enough, you have some truly out there ideas like, paranormal phenomena, or even, as one source mentioned, a hurricane hitting Siberia in winter. Of course, the idea of a hurricane in Siberia in the middle of winter is pretty far-fetched, to say the least.
Yeah. Okay, so we have all these strange circumstances, decades of speculation, and then in 2019, the Russian government decides to reopen the investigation. What did they focus on this time around?
So in 2019, the investigation, this time led by a prosecutor named Andrei Kuryakov, decided to specifically focus on weather-related phenomena. They looked at traditional avalanches, the possibility of moving snow slabs, and initially even considered a hurricane, although, as we've established, that last one was pretty quickly dismissed. In the end, Kuryakov proposed that the most likely explanation was what's known as a slab avalanche.
And I remember reading in the articles you gave that this theory, initially at least, it was met with quite a bit of skepticism. After all, the slope where they found the tent, it didn't seem steep enough for a typical avalanche, right? And there weren't any of the usual signs of avalanche debris that you might expect. Plus, the severity of the injuries on those last four bodies, it's hard to see how that fits in with a typical avalanche burial.
Right, exactly. And this is where the research by those Swiss scientists, Johann Gome and Alexander M. Puzerin, becomes really important. Their work was published in 2021, and they used some really sophisticated mathematical modeling to test this slab avalanche theory, specifically in relation to the Dyatlov Pass incident.
And their findings were really pretty interesting. They suggested that a slab avalanche, while maybe not the most obvious explanation, was actually a very plausible scenario given the specific conditions at the Dyatlov Pass.
Yeah.
So how did their research kind of explain that? How does a slab avalanche even happen?
Well, they identified a few key things. First, the shape of the ground beneath the snowpack, the topography, it was irregular. It wasn't a smooth, consistent slope. So there could have been areas that were locally much steeper than the average, even if the overall slope wasn't that dramatic. And then, perhaps even more importantly, the hikers had dug into the snow to put up their tent, right? Which makes sense. You want some shelter from the wind and the cold. But what they may not have realized was that by doing that, they could have destabilized the snowpack above. And there was this layer of weak ice that had formed earlier in the winter, and it was sitting there underneath all that snow. So you have this potentially unstable layer, and then on top of that, the wind had deposited even more snow. So all those things together could have been enough to trigger a release of that snow slab.
So it's like the hikers, by trying to create a safe, sheltered spot, they may have accidentally set the stage for this disaster. And then I remember from the articles that the researchers, they ran simulations using weather data from that time, and it actually supported the idea that a relatively small slab avalanche could have been enough to cause the chest and skull injuries, especially if the hikers were lying down when it hit.
Right, exactly. And a small avalanche might not sound like much, but we're talking about a dense slab of snow. And the force of that, even a relatively small amount, can be enormous, especially if it hits you when you're lying down, like, say, sleeping in a tent. That kind of blunt force trauma could definitely explain those injuries. And it also explains why the hikers might have slashed their way out of the tent and run out into the freezing cold in such a panic. If you're sleeping and something like that hits you, it must have been terrifying.
Right, it would have been like a nightmare.
Mm.
And then there's the fact that some of them weren't wearing much clothing, which is strange in such cold temperatures. The articles mentioned paradoxical undressing.
Mm.
I know I've heard of that before, but can you explain what that is for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, so paradoxical undressing, it's a really strange and sad phenomenon that can happen in cases of extreme hypothermia. When the body's core temperature drops really low, it can actually send mixed signals to the brain. So the person might start feeling incredibly hot even though they're freezing. And so they start taking off their clothes, which just makes the situation even worse.
Wow, so it's like your body's betraying you at the worst possible moment.
Hmm.
And then, with the last four bodies, the fact that they weren't found until months later, well, that unfortunately means there's a good chance that scavenging animals might have been responsible for some of the missing soft tissues.
Yeah. I mean, decomposition and scavenging, those are natural processes. And over that amount of time, they can definitely explain some of the more disturbing aspects of the remains.
Okay, so we've talked about the slab avalanche, but even with that, there's still the question of those really severe injuries on the last four. The crushed chests, the fractured skull. Even with the weight of the snow, that's a lot of force. How does the avalanche theory account for that level of damage?
Well, this is where the idea of a secondary event comes in. The theory is that maybe, after escaping the initial avalanche, they tried to find better shelter. Maybe they dug a snow den, or maybe they tried to get down into that ravine near the stream for protection. But then something else happened. Maybe the snow den collapsed on them, or maybe they fell into that creek bed, and it was lined with rocks or frozen branches. So you have the force of the avalanche, and then on top of that, they get hit with another significant impact, which could explain those more localized really severe injuries. And the fact that they were found in that ravine, some of them lying face down, that does kind of support this idea of a secondary event after the avalanche.
So it's like a series of unfortunate events, each one compounding the last. Okay, so this scientific explanation, it seems to be the most plausible one we have. But then why did the Dyatlov Pass incident stay such a big mystery for so long? Why did it capture people's imagination in such a big way?
I think it's a few things. First, like we talked about, there was that initial secrecy from the Soviet authorities. The vague explanation they gave, it just made people suspicious, and it left a lot of room for speculation. And of course, there were no survivors to tell their story, so we're left to piece together what happened from the evidence. And there are all those strange details, the slashed tent, the missing clothing, the weird injuries. It just doesn't fit neatly into any simple explanation. Even with the slab avalanche theory, which is the best we have, there are still some things we don't know for sure.
Right, some pieces of the puzzle are still missing. Okay, so for our listeners, if we try to summarize the most likely sequence of events based on the evidence and the science, what does that narrative look like?
All right, so the most plausible explanation is that a slab avalanche hit the hikers' tent, probably triggered by accident when they set up their camp. They had to cut their way out and run out into the freezing cold, and then they died from a combination of hypothermia and the injuries they got from that avalanche. But then there was probably a second event. Maybe a snow den collapsed, or maybe they fell into that ravine, and that's what caused those really severe injuries on the last four.
Okay, so we have a pretty good scientific explanation, but it's important to remember, for everyone listening, that there are still some parts of this that are speculation. We don't have any eyewitnesses, and it happened a long time ago, so we might never know everything for sure. And those unanswered questions, those missing pieces, they keep people interested. They keep people coming back to this story and trying to figure it out.
Right. And it's that ambiguity, that mystery that makes it so fascinating. It's like a blank canvas where people can project their own fears, their anxieties, their desire for answers. And you see that in all the different theories that have come up over the years. Some are plausible, some are pretty out there. But it shows you how this incident really captured the public imagination.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Uh,
How often do we try to find these neat and tidy explanations for complex events, even when the truth might be a lot messier?
The Dyatlov Pass Incident, it's a reminder that sometimes we just don't have all the answers.
Hmm.
And those unanswered questions, they can be powerful and keep us thinking, keep us searching for the truth. And it makes you wonder what other seemingly straightforward events that we think we understand, what other mysteries might be hiding just beneath the surface. It's definitely something to ponder, even after this deep dive is over. So thank you all for joining us today. We'll see you next time.